Listen closely. There are stories that pass like wind, easy to forget before morning comes. But there are others that cling to your bones long after the telling. This is one of those stories. It was told to me by an old woman who sat near the fire and said, "What I give you is not a tale. It is a warning." In the village of Amara, tucked between a wide river and tall palm trees, a wedding had just taken place. The drums had spoken. A young woman named Adis had been brought into the home of Chakwameka, a respected hunter, as his bride. Adis was quiet and gentle. Her eyes held a deep calm that made elders nod when she passed. The women said she was a good wife. The men said Chakwameka was lucky. But joy in Amara did not stay long that season. 3 nights after the wedding, an old woman named Mama Obiajili walked to fetch water. There, in the silence of midnight, she saw something that made her drop her clay pot and press her back against the wall. The new bride, dressed in white barefoot on the cold earth, was walking alone toward the river. Mama Obiajili watched until the darkness swallowed her. Then she whispered to the night, "What kind of woman is this?" The next morning, the marketplace of Amara was alive with more than trading. Women leaned over baskets of yam and pepper, their voices low but fast. "Did you hear?" one whispered. Mama Obiajili saw her, the new bride, walking to the river at midnight. Another woman clicked her tongue. "Barefoot? Alone?" The first nodded. And the owls were crying. In Amara, it was well known that no good woman walks when owls cry. The night belonged to spirits, not to brides who should be wrapped in the warmth of their husband's compound. By afternoon the story had wings. Some said Adis had whispered strange words into the dark water. One woman swore she saw a faint glow near the forest that same night. Chakwameka had none of this. He had woken at dawn to find his wife already sweeping the compound, her face peaceful, her hands steady. But someone else in Amara heard every word. Her name was Needy. She had wide, watchful eyes and a heart full of something she refused to call jealousy. She had hoped for a long time that Chakwameka would choose her. He had not. As she listened to the whispers grow louder, Needy smiled slowly to herself. Something useful had just fallen into her hands. That night, Chakwameka decided to test what his heart already feared. He lay on his sleeping mat and closed his eyes, but did not sleep. He breathed slowly, the way a man breathes when the world thinks him gone. He felt Adis beside him, still at first, like carved wood. He waited. The night insect sang. Then, in the deepest part of the night, he heard it. The soft sound of careful movement. The whisper of cloth. Bare feet on the earth floor. She was gone. He lay alone in the dark, his chest heavy with something between anger and grief. He had been married only a few days. He had looked at her face at their wedding and felt proud. But what kind of wife leaves her husband's side in the night? He thought about following her. Instead, he turned onto his back and stared at the thatched ceiling, watching shadows shift as the moon moved. Before she left, she had placed something by the door. He rose and looked closely. A small clay bowl filled with white sand. He did not understand what it meant. But one thing was now certain, tomorrow night, he would follow her. He pressed his palm against the door frame and made himself a quiet promise. No more pretending. No more closed eyes. Tomorrow night, he would see the truth for himself. The following night, Chakwameka did not close his eyes. The moment Adis rose from the mat, he was already moving. He pulled a dark cloth around his shoulders and slipped out the back while she walked out the front. He followed her shadow through the sleeping village, staying far enough behind that she would not hear his feet on the soft earth. She moved through the tall grass at the village edge without hesitating, took the narrow path between the trees, and came at last to the riverbank. Chakwameka crouched behind a wide tree trunk, his heart loud. Adis knelt at the water's edge. She pressed both palms flat onto the surface of the river. The moonlight fell across her face and she looked, not frightened, not wicked, but deeply, quietly sorrowful. Like someone carrying a weight no one else could see. Then she whispered. "Not tonight. Please, not tonight." Her voice was barely a sound. But he heard every word. And he watched as the river answered. The water rippled, not from wind, for there was none. It moved from beneath, slow and deliberate, circling her hands like something breathing. Chakwameka pressed himself harder against the tree. His body had gone cold. He was a hunter. He had faced leopards in the forest without flinching. But what he had just witnessed, this was not something a spear could stop. Needy did not waste time. While the village whispered and wondered, she moved with purpose. She understood that a story told to the right person at the right moment could become as powerful as any weapon. She went first to Mama Chidinma, the oldest woman on the eastern side, whose word carried the weight of iron in any gathering. Needy sat with her over morning collar and leaned close. "Mama," she said softly, "I am worried. A woman who walks at night, this is not the way of our people." Mama Chidinma chewed slowly and said nothing. But her eyes were listening. Then Needy visited the diviner, an angular old man named Nosu, who lived alone where the path disappeared into the forest. People brought him questions they feared to ask the elders. He always had answers. Needy sat across from him and described what had been reported about Addis. Nosu was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice dry as old wood, "If she walks at night, she walks with spirits." He said nothing more. But as Needy rose to leave, she glanced back. And Nosu was smiling. Not a kind smile. The smile of a man who knows the ending and is pleased with how it was arranged. Needy walked home quickly. That smile made her feel, just for a moment, like a tool in someone else's hand. It happened at the evening gathering near the great Iroko tree at the center of Amara. Addis was there, helping an older wife sort dried beans. She did not notice the conversations growing quieter around her. She did not see the sideways glances. Then Mama Obiajili stood. "I must speak what I have seen. 3 nights ago, I saw the new wife of Chakwameka walking alone to the river at midnight. Barefoot. Saying nothing to anyone. All eyes turned to Addis. She looked up. Her face showed no panic, no anger, calm in the way of deep water, still on the surface with unknown things moving below. An elder spoke. "Wife of Chakwameka, do you deny this?" She did not. "Then explain yourself." Addis' hands went still over the beans. She looked at the faces around her, fear, suspicion, hunger for an answer. She opened her mouth, then closed it. And then she said, in a voice so low it was almost a prayer. "If I speak the truth, the river will collect its debt." A gasp moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. And at that exact moment, from a sky with not one cloud, thunder cracked so loudly that children screamed and women pulled their little ones close. The gathering dissolved. But no one in Amara forgot what she had said. 2 days after the gathering, the village woke to terrible news. Okafor, a fisherman known for his loud laugh and his refusal to fear anything, had drowned in the river. His canoe was found upright, undamaged, resting near the bank as if placed there by careful hands. But Okafor was found face down in the shallows, as though something had pulled him from behind and held him. His wife tore her wrapper and screamed until her voice gave out. His children sat in the dust and did not understand. But beneath the grief, something darker grew. It was remembered that Okafor had been at the gathering 2 days before. It was remembered that he had laughed at Addis' warning about the river. He had waved his hand and said, "Rubbish. Women and their stories." He had been the loudest voice dismissing her. Now Okafor was dead. The village did not say outright that Addis had caused it. But the thought passed from person to person without words, traveling on sideways looks and slow nods. An emergency council was called for the next morning. The compound of eldest Elder Motsi Is was filled before sunrise with the troubled people of Amara, frightened and in need of someone to blame. Chakwameka sat among the men with his jaw tight and his eyes saying nothing. The council of elders sat on carved wooden stools arranged in a half-circle under the great Iroko tree. Motsi Is, the oldest among them, held his ivory staff with eyes that had seen 70 harvests. Addis stood at the center. Alone. Chakwameka sat to the side. He had not spoken to his wife that morning. He had wanted to open his mouth twice at the doorway of their heart. But the words did not come, caught somewhere between what he had seen at the river and what he still did not understand. Nosu the diviner sat apart, long fingers folded in his lap, watching with his familiar still smile. The elders spoke of what had been witnessed. They spoke of Okafor. They asked questions with no easy answers. Then Nosu rose. He measured each word carefully. He said the river spirits were angered. He said that when a woman brings hidden things into a man's compound, that the whole village suffers. The only way to know the truth, he declared, was to test the accused at the river at midnight. If she is innocent, he said, the river will be still. Motsi is looked at Adis. Do you accept? Adis raised her head. Her voice did not shake. I accept. The crowd exhaled as one. The test would be 3 nights from now. When midnight arrived on the night of the test, all of Amara came to the river. They carried torches and stood in a wide half-circle on the bank, their light flickering against the black water, faces tight with fear. Even those who said they did not believe in such things had come, because in Amara, no one fully disbelieved. Adis walked to the bank alone. She wore a simple white cloth. Her feet were bare. She did not look left or right as she moved through the crowd, did not look at Chakwameka, though he stood near the front with his torch unlit in his hands, his eyes following her every step. She reached the water's edge. She stepped in, one foot, then the other, until the river was at her ankles. And then something happened that made the crowd stumble backward as one body. The water parted. Slowly, like curtains drawing apart, the river pulled away from her feet, not much, just enough to be clearly seen. A narrow strip of dry riverbed appeared beneath her. No one had any words. Then, from the dark depths beneath the surface, something spoke, not in a human voice, but felt in the chest before heard by the ears. Adis' knees buckled. She fell. The voice came from below the water and inside the earth at the same time. 3 words. Only 3. But they landed on the crowd like stones dropped from a great height, and no one who stood at that river would ever forget the sound of them. She is bound. Then silence is the deep, pressing kind that feels heavier than noise. Adis lay collapsed at the water's edge, half in and half out of the river. 2 women rushed forward and pulled her to dry ground. She was breathing. Her eyes were closed. Her hands lay open at her sides like an offering. The crowd could not speak. The torches sputtered in a wind that came from nowhere and died just as quickly. Chakwameka pushed through and knelt beside his wife. He touched her face. Her skin was cold, not the cold of sickness, but the cold of deep river in Harmattan. He gathered her up and looked at the surrounding villagers. Their faces showed fear turning into something else, though mixed with deeper suspicion. She is bound. Bound to what? Bound how? No one said it aloud. But inside every mind, the word moved like smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to ignore. Nosu stood at the back of the crowd. He had not flinched at the voice. He had not stepped back with the others. He simply nodded, slowly, as if the river had just confirmed something he had been waiting patiently to hear. It was Adis' mother who told the truth, not to the village, but to Chakwameka alone 3 days later when she arrived after hearing the news. She sat in his hut with her wrapper pulled tight and said, "You must hear this before anyone else speaks." When Adis was 12, her younger brother, a boy named Emeka, the light of their family, fell deeply ill. The healers said he was too far gone. The herbs failed. His breath grew shallow. One evening, Adis walked alone to the river and knelt at the bank. She was 12 years old and desperate in the way that only those who truly love can be desperate. She made a vow. She said, "Take my nights. Take my sleep. But let my brother live." Emeka recovered by morning. In 3 days he was sitting up and asking for food. The healers called it a miracle. Only Adis knew the price. From that night forward, she had to rise in the dark hours and go to the water. Not because she wanted to, but because she had given her word. And the river, in all the villages along its banks, does not forget a vow. Chukwuemeka sat very still for a long time after the old woman finished. Outside, he could hear the village going about its mourning. And he thought, they have no idea. Not one of them has any idea. What happens, Chukwuemeka asked slowly, if she does not go? Adi's mother looked at him with tired eyes. She has not missed a single night in 8 years. Because she knows the cost. She explained it carefully, the way you speak of something you have lived with so long it has become a painful wisdom. If Adis pressed her palms to the water each night and whispered her plea, she held back something old and hungry living beneath the current. Something that had been slowly rising long before she made her vow. Her oath had become a lock on a door the village did not know existed. But if she missed a night, if she was too sick, too watched, too afraid to go, the door would crack. And the river would take something in her place. Chukwuemeka thought of Okafor. The fisherman found face down in the shallows. Had Adis missed that night, held back by fear of being seen, by the gathering that had already begun to accuse her? He walked to the door and looked toward the river path. She needs to go tonight, he said. Yes, her mother replied. But she is still unconscious. If she misses tonight. She did not finish. Chukwuemeka looked at the sky. The sun was already moving toward evening. And Adis lay behind him, still and pale, with no sign of waking. The child went missing just before dawn. His name was Tobena. He was 5 years old, a nephew of Nidi, and he had wandered from his mother's hut while everyone slept. By the time his mother noticed the empty mat, the birds were already calling. The village erupted. Such parties went in every direction, through the cassava farms, along the forest path, behind the compound walls. Men ran toward the river fast, because in Amara the river was always where fear took you. They found him at the bank, sitting in the mud, staring at the water with blank, wide eyes that seemed to look at something no one else could see. He was unhurt. He did not remember walking there. He did not remember anything. But the river had risen. Not by much, just a few inches above its normal level, creeping up the bank, licking the roots of the riverside trees. The fisherman said the current was wrong, moving in the wrong direction for the season. Inside his hut, Chukwuemeka sat beside his still unconscious wife. He had held her hand through the night. He did not know if she had somehow fulfilled her oath in the dark hours, or if the spirit world worked in ways no waking mind could follow. Outside, he heard Nidi's voice rise above the others, ask where the bride was when that child walked to the river. The river kept rising. Adis opened her eyes at midday. She did not ask where she was. The first thing she did was look at her palms, reading something there that only she could see. Chukwuemeka was at her side. I know about the oath, he said. She turned and looked at him. Something moved in her eyes, not relief exactly, but the exhaustion of someone who has carried a secret so long that being found out feels more like grief than freedom. Your mother told me, he added. A long silence settled between them like dust after a storm. I should have told you before the wedding, she said. I wanted to. But how do you tell a man you are about to marry that you belong, partly, to a river? You find a way, he said. His voice was harder than he intended. I was afraid you would not take me, she said simply. He had no answer. Because he knew, if he was honest, she was probably right. He was a proud man from a proud family. River oaths were not what any man imagined when he thought of his wife. The child, Nidi's nephew, he began. I know. She closed her eyes. I tried to reach the water but could not move. Her voice cracked. I am sorry for that child. Chukwuemeka looked at his wife's worn, exhausted face, then felt something that was not suspicion. It was shame. Now we must walk to the edge of the forest, to the heart of Nwosu the diviner. Because behind every story that seems to be about a woman walking in the night, there is another story. An older one. A darker one. Nwosu had lived at the edge of Amara for 30 years. He had built his reputation the way a spider builds its web, one thread at a time, patient and invisible. He was not simply a man who read signs. He was a man who made signs. For 20 years, Nwosu had been feeding the river. Not with the honest offerings of village elders. With dark things buried at the deepest bend of the bank in new moon hours to bind a spirit beneath the water to his will. A spirit he used for knowledge, for power, for fear. A village that is afraid needs a diviner. A diviner who creates the fear never runs out of work. He had been doing this long before Adis made her oath. In fact, her oath had complicated his arrangements considerably. Her nightly visits calmed the spirit he spent years agitating. Without knowing it, she had been fighting him for 8 years. And now he had maneuvered the village into blaming her, binding her, and removing the one thing standing between the spirit and full control. Nwosu looked at his tools and smiled. Everything was going as planned. The signs appeared in Adis' body like sentences written in a language only sickness speaks. She rose the night after waking and walked to the river as always. She pressed her palms to the water. She whispered. But when she returned and sat on the step of her hut, she began to cough, a deep, wet cough that shook her whole frame. Chakwameka came to her. She tried to wave him away. But the coughing continued. When she pulled her hand from her mouth, there was blood on her palm. She stared at it. How long? He asked, crouching beside her. Getting worse for months, she admitted. The river takes something in return. It always has. At first just tiredness. Then the sleep I lost. Now. She did not finish. He looked at her hands. He had not noticed before, she always kept them wrapped to her wrists. But now in the firelight he could see clearly faint marks on her palms, like old burns tracing the lines where she pressed the water each night. 8 years. She had done this for 8 years. He sat beside her on the step. Neither spoke. The night insects sang. The palm fronds moved. Adis was getting weaker. The oath that saved her brother was slowly spending her life. And the village she had been silently protecting still believed she was the danger. Chakwameka was a hunter. He knew the forest better than his own compound. He knew which paths were worn by animals and which by human feet. He knew when a sound meant presence. The day after he saw blood on Adis' palm, he rose before dawn and went into the forest, not to hunt, but to look. He had been thinking about Nwosu. About the smile that never reached the old man's eyes. About how quickly he had offered the river test, as though he already knew what the river would say. He followed the eastern path toward Nwosu's hut, veered off before reaching it, and pushed through the bush until he found what he had suspected, a place where the ground had been disturbed repeatedly, near the deepest bend of the river. He knelt and examined the earth. Buried objects. Old. The soil dark with offerings. He recognized the materials from stories his father had told him. Things used not in healing, but in agitation. In binding. In calling. He stood and listened. Chanting, low, rhythmic, from deeper in the trees. Not prayers. Something older and colder. Then a branch cracked behind him. He turned. Nwosu stood 10 feet away on the path, his eyes fixed on Chakwameka. His expression was completely still. The two men looked at each other in the grey morning light of the forest. Nwosu broke the silence fast. A hunter without a spear. That is not good sense. What are you burying at the river, old man? Offerings, Nwosu replied simply, as though the question were about something ordinary. For what purpose? The diviner tilted his head. A diviner's tools are not the business of hunters. Chakwameka took one step forward. My wife has been bleeding for months because she fights something beneath that river every night. Something that was placed there. Something that does not belong to any natural spirit. His voice was quiet and dangerous. The voice of a man who has decided what he will do and is simply waiting for the right moment. That is very much my business. Something shifted in Nwosu's eyes. Not fear, a reassessment. Then the old man smiled, turned, and walked back toward his hut without another word. Chakwameka watched him go, jaw tight. Nwosu was not afraid of being discovered, which meant he was not yet finished. Whatever had been set in motion, the final piece had not yet fallen. He ran back to the village. He went straight to Motsi's and asked to speak privately. He spoke for a long time. When he was done, the eldest elder sat back on his stool and was very still for a very long time. Motsi is called for Nwosu. The message was sent with two younger men who left no room for misunderstanding. The village gathered again at the Iroko tree, but this time the mood had shifted. A few elders had begun asking questions about Nwosu that had not been asked in a long time. Answers surfaced slowly, like objects rising from still water. When Nwosu arrived, he sat where he was directed and looked at the crowd with his usual measured expression. Chakwameka stood and spoke. He described the buried offerings. He named what they were used for. Nwosu listened. When Chakwameka finished, the diviner rose and turned to the crowd with the ease of a man who had survived many such moments. This hunter is a desperate husband protecting a dangerous wife. He spread his hands wide. Look at what she has brought since she arrived. The fisherman drowned. A child nearly taken. Strange voices from the water. He shook his head. I understand his love for her. But love blinds men. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Even those who had begun to doubt turned uncertain again. By evening, Motsi, caught between two stories with no clear proof for either, made his ruling. Hadis was to be bound at the river at sunrise. The crowd exhaled. It was easier to have someone to bind than to sit with doubt. They bound her wrists with white rope before sunrise. The air was cold and damp with the river's breath. Torches lined the bank again. The village stood in the same half-circle as before. But tighter now, drawn close by accumulated fear and the terrible weight of finality. Hadis did not fight. She walked with them to the bank and stood at the water's edge with her hands bound before her, face as still as carved stone. Chakwameka stood apart, his arms at his sides, his face grey. Nwosu stood at the edge of the torchlight, watching. The eldest elder began to speak the ritual words, bold words, heavy words, the kind that once spoken cannot easily be unsaid. And then the river changed. It happened between one breath and the next. The current reversed. The water pulled back 3 feet, then surged forward, not violently, but with enormous slow purpose, like something massive turning in its sleep. Every torch went out at once. In the absolute darkness, the voice came again, louder than before, the ground vibrating with it, a sound like the lowest note of the oldest drum. Not 3 words this time. 4. She is my shield. And the river rose. The water climbed the bank with purpose. Not a careless flood, a directed rising. It reached the first line of torches and snuffed them in cold silence. People screamed and scrambled backward. The rope around Hadis' wrists fell, though no one had touched it. She stood where she was. The voice from the river spoke in full sentences now, the way a person speaks when they have been silent too long. This woman did not bring darkness to your village. She has been holding darkness back. 8 years of her nights she has given. 8 years of her strength. She is the reason you still have a village to stand in. The river paused at the second line of torches. The one who has fed me fear sits among you. Nwosu, at the edge of the torchlight, began stepping backward. Without her protection, I would have taken this village long ago, not because I wished to, but because I was made hungry by old and dark hands. I have waited 8 years for someone to look closely enough to see the truth. Hadis sank to her knees at the water's edge. Not in collapse, in the exhaustion of someone whose long fight is finally, almost, over. Chakwameka ran through the crowd and knelt beside her. He held her hands. There was nothing yet that words could carry. The river stopped rising. But it did not recede. It held still and watching, as the village stood in frightened silence along its edge. Hadis was on her knees and Chakwameka was beside her. He held her hands, those worn, marked palms that had pressed the water 1,000 nights while the village slept safely and never knew. You should have told me, he said. I know, she said. I would have stood beside you. She looked at him. Her eyes held the cautious hope of someone who has had little reason for hope and is not certain she is allowed to feel it. I was not sure, she said. He had no answer. He had not, in the days of his suspicion, been a man who deserved her certainty. Then Adis said something that surprised them both. The spirit needs a new guardian. A willing one. If no one offers willingly, the river returns to feeding on what it can reach. Everything Nosu built will remain under the water, pooling. She looked at the current. I will offer myself completely, to seal the old damage forever. She moved toward the water. Chakwameka stepped forward and caught her arm. No, he said. Not you, Chakwameka said. He turned to face the river. He stood very straight, the way his father had taught him, his shoulders back, chin level, not defiant, just present. I will offer myself, he said to the water. I am her husband. What is hers is mine to carry. The river moved, not in warning, but in consideration. And then, from somewhere behind them, came a sound they did not expect, the sound of stumbling. Nosu had tried to run. But the river had other ideas. The water had risen quietly behind the diviner as he moved through the crowd. It had circled him, gently but absolutely, and now he stood on a small island of dry ground, surrounded by still water, unable to move without stepping in. He was shaking. For the first time in 30 years of manufacturing fear, Nosu was genuinely afraid. The river spirit's voice came once more. Reveal yourself. Reveal what you have done. And the water will judge. The crowd was completely still. And then, because there was nowhere left to hide, Nosu began to speak. He named every offering. Every dark night at the riverbank. Every year of agitation. He named how he had used Nidi's jealousy as his instrument, not caring what it cost her. When he was done, the water around him rose to his ankles. Then it rose further. The river claimed Nosu, but not as death. This is the part the old woman always said was the most important detail. He did not drown. The water rose to his chest and then, to every watching eye in Amara, it held him. The voice of the river spirit spoke once more, directed at Nosu alone. You fed me greed for 30 years. Now you will feed me with service. The water rose to his shoulders. You will guard this river. You will hold back what you stirred. You will serve where you once ruled. This is not death. This is replacement. Nosu's face, in those last moments above the water, showed no peace. But it showed something that might, if you are generous, be called understanding. The face of a man who loses what he built badly and knows, finally, that it had to fall. The river covered him. Then the water receded, calmly, like a decision made and settled. Back to its banks. Back to its usual level. The torches were relit one by one. Amara stood in the early grey of dawn, wet, frightened, then fundamentally changed. Nidi sat at the back of the crowd with her hands over her face. She did not cry. She sat quietly with what she had helped to build and what it had cost. No one said anything to her. Some things the silence says better. The river calmed for the first time in generations. The old fisherman noticed fast, the current clean and true, the water clearing to a color not seen since childhood. Fish returned to parts of the river empty for years. The farms along the bank grew better that harvest than any elder could remember. Adis did not need to walk at midnight anymore. On the first night after Nosu was taken, she simply slept. She slept through the night, through the morning birds, and until the sun was already warm. When she woke, she pressed her palms together and felt nothing pulling at her from the water. The oath had dissolved when its purpose was fulfilled. She cried quietly, without apology, the way you cry when something carried for 8 years is finally lifted from your back. Chakwameka sat beside her and held her hands, those marked one palms, and did not try to take the tears away. At the next village gathering, he stood before the elders and the people of Amara. He waited until the compound was quiet. Then he said, "If only we had known what she carried for us, we would have guarded the one who guarded us." No one argued. No one looked away. The old woman by the fire always paused here. She let the silence hold its shape. Then she looked at you directly and said, "What would you have done if you were the villagers? Would you have believed her or condemned her?" The fire crackled. The night waited. And the river flowed on.